This video is going to be different from my others because this time it's going to be an informative video based on the community surrounding PPT and not simply just gameplay of it. If you're interested in this type of style and want more, I plan on making more in the future, so make sure you're subscribed. With that said, let's get into the video and thank you for watching. In many contexts of the contemporary Western video game scene, it's safe to say that PPT is a niche game. To the wider world, it's just another version of Tetris, but this time you need to fork over an above average amount of cash to play it. To people who play puzzle games competitively, it just seems like a worse version of Puyo and a worse version of Tetris haphazardly stuck together into an overall bad package. To Tetris players, it seems like that one laggy game where all the players use that one overpowered strategy. And even some PPT players see it as a game to move on from. Not that I take any issue with them doing this. How did this happen though? How did PPT become a niche game in every context, and is there any hope of mainstream appeal in the future? In order to understand this, one must go back to where PPT started. PPT was released in Japan on February 6, 2014. Already playing other Tetris games, the Western scene really didn't take that much notice to the game for 3 years. In 2017, 2 LAN tournaments on YouTube really received some popularity, CE Otaku 2017 and Animivo 2017. Many PPT players to this day regard these tournaments as what got them into playing the game competitively. I myself do fall into this boat. After getting the demo for PPT on my Switch, I looked on YouTube to see if this new game had any competitive scene, and sure enough, I found these 2 YouTube videos. These tournaments have such a sentimental value to me because of how enthralled I was with the gameplay. The players were playing the game faster than I had ever seen, and the commentators, well inexperienced in PPT.
Oh, you built another DCL right here.
That's a double-double. That's a lot. That's it.
Exemplified it almost perfectly. To me, the winners of these tournaments gave way to the first real sense of top players in the scene. These players were Wombo, DDR Dan, Steelix, and Amamiya. Less than a year later, PPT received a localization on Steam, further expanding the competitive scene.
That was a 4K for player 4 and it's at like maybe like 5. Okay. Alright, Tetris down. SOS. God lost it. That's over. Alright. Alright. Oh my god, Flash Man cannot believe what just happened.
Amamiya pumping his fist in the air like I'm nice.
After the localization, the online scene was booming and many people were excited to play this fresh new version of Tetris. When online, you could expect to not have to wait longer than a few seconds to get a match in Puzzle League. Everyone was excited to see what the future held for Tetris. 6 months after the game's release, the first Salty Cup was held and registration ended on September 1st, 2018. While not being the first tournament, Salty Cup kickstarted the online tournament scene in the West, with the abundance of hype matches the tournament had to offer. The tournament ended up being won by the aforementioned Wombo, who ended up sweeping his league 10-0. If you're wondering why I said league and not bracket, that's because it was a round-robin tournament. Round robins are a form of tournament that is almost exclusively run on PPT for some reason, even to this day. To the uninitiated, a round robin is a tournament when players are put into leagues and then made to fight each person in the league either 1 or 2 times. Whoever wins the most matches wins the league. It seems that leagues first originated in the PPT community from Aruni's league, which then inspired Salted's league, which then inspired many others, including myself, to run leagues. Salty Cup was the last tournament of this era though. Meanwhile, the PPT audience began to get established on Twitch, with streamers like Wombo, Garbo, and Dorami. It's also worth mentioning that the top players of the time were the same people in Salty Cup S League. These people were Aruni, Wombo, Hiroki, Dorami, and One Pun Man. The next important tournament would also be run by saltedbread, with Salty Cup Season 2. This tournament was another stacked tournament with plenty of hype matches, but this time something was different. To win the first Salty Cup, Wombo used a strategy of center forward. Wombo attempted to do the exact same thing here, but this time it didn't work against Dorami, who had scraped out a win against it. Despite Dorami being able to beat Wombo's forward, the community was beginning to dislike center forward due to it being easy to one-trick. This hatred of center forward led to the first whispers in the community of PPT not being a good game. Of course, when the game first came out, some players disliked it, but that is to be expected for every release. But this time, players disliked the game because of center forward. The netcode of the game also made people dislike it, with the peer-to-peer connection used not exactly being the most stable at times. especially when playing against someone far away geographically. You might be wondering now, why did it take 5 years for people to decide the game was bad? For the first 3 years it was obvious, nobody even played the game. In 2017, when there were the 2 LAN tournaments, nearly everyone loved them. In 2018, when Salty Cup was the first tournament run, everyone was still getting used to the game and it felt fresh. In the 2019 tournament, the freshness of the game had worn off to expose one of the biggest issues with the game, its netcode. A large part of why the 2017 tournaments were so beloved was because they were done locally, making netcode-based lag impossible. When PPT is pushed to its limits, the peer-to-peer netcode falters. Saltedbread, likely keeping this in mind along with the 4-wide ban, ran the first Xeno PPT event, the first LAN tournament for PPT in a very long time. The tournament was held on October 26, 2019, and was beloved by almost everyone, much like the 2017 tournaments. Side note before I end this chapter, when I said almost everyone loved the Xeno tournaments, that's because Xeno actually got on the Twitter account scrub quotes for the 4-wide ban. I think what happened was, someone who was uninvolved with the community saw the 4-wide bans on the poster, assumed Saltedbread was just too bad at the game to use 4-wide, and then sent it in. While not particularly important to the story, it's still funny seeing fighting game people demonstrate their lack of knowledge towards PPT. Depending on who you ask, in early 2020, there was either a massive government conspiracy or a global pandemic. Either way, this meant people could no longer visit each other, which also meant the Xeno locals are now off the table. Salted was still able to run Salty Cup Season 3, but there is something looming on the horizon. Not only did the quarantine make the best environment to run PPT tournaments impossible, but there is also a brand new game with a significantly better netcode, Tetris. The combination of the game having a good netcode and everyone being stuck at home meant the game instantly skyrocketed, with a sizable amount of PPT players jumping ship to play Tetris. Even the aforementioned streamer, Garbo, was one of these PPT players that switched to Tetris. This would be one of many hits to PPT in 2020. Another hit to PPT was the WPL 4-wide incident. On July 11th, 2020, Beast and Shin ran WPL Open number 6 on Puyo Puyo Tetris for the PC. This was an ordinary tournament until the grand finals between Wumbo and Kazu. In order to understand what's happening though, one must understand what the art of the stall wide is. When both players use 4-wide on each other, it becomes optimal to accept garbage for the chance to extend the combo with the down stack. When both players know this though, it results in the stall wide. The goal of the stall wide is to play slower than your opponent so that you accept garbage from their combo. This, obviously, is incredibly monotonous to watch because both players are purposefully playing slow. Back to the grand finals though, Wumbo and Kazu are both stall widing. While stall wide had always been a possibility in PPT, this example was particularly egregious. Kazu was and still is considered to be in the top 3 PPT players of all time. Wumbo though was not. The match made it seem like someone can win games against significantly better players by using center 4-wide. This match would be used to death as an example of why PPT is bad, usually done in comparison to Tetris. Yet another part of the paradigm shift towards Tetris.
Skylar. All the things that I did. You need to understand.
I have to hear one more time that you did this for the
community.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it.
Despite the rocky beginning of the year and summer for PPT, many factors contributed to this period of the game being the best time to be a PPT player. Such things include Tetris 99 being released on February 13th of the prior year and exploding in popularity. This would create a new generation of Tetris players who, by the late summer of 2020, would become highly skilled in the game. There are many reasons these players improved so quickly, with some of the biggest reasons being the newfound resources in the community now available to them, and the quarantine giving them lots of free time to practice. On August 26, 2020, the sequel to PPT was announced on the Puyo official Twitter account. The release date was set to be December 8th of that year on the Nintendo Switch and other consoles, then on PC later in 2021. Instantly, the expectations were set high for this game. The feature of spectator mode in Puyo Puyo Champions made people assume it would also be in PPT. The lagging netcode in the previous game was assumed to be set to get fixed, and the pro player Amamiya was even said to be in cahoots with the developer. A few days before the announcement, the organization Puzzle Kingdom was founded. Puzzle Kingdom was the first organization to run online PPT tournaments with an emphasis on production value. All throughout this time too, until September, WPL PPT Opens were regularly run. Throughout this video, I never explained why people like PPT, so this begs the question, why in fact do people like this game? It's simple, the mechanics. PPT's mechanics, probably accidentally, are designed in a way that fancy and efficient gameplay is rewarded. This makes for an incredibly dynamic viewing and playing experience. Due to the main appeal of the game lying in its mechanics, game developers can design a game with similar mechanics, fix some of the problems with PPT, and instantly have a better game in the eyes of most players. This is exactly what happened with Tetra Online. The game was first conceptualized in November 2019 by the developer and Tetris player Mine. Development continued on this game for another year and was announced on October 21st to be released on Steam on November 30th, 2020. After its release, Tetra Online was instantly loved by the community as both an indie game made by a community member and a viable replacement for PPT. Back to PPT though, Puzzle Kingdom and WPL announced their newest tournament, Square 1. This was a highly ambitious tournament set to happen after the release of PPT 2. Square 1 was unique in many ways. First, it was an invitational, double elimination tournament of 20 players. These players either qualified in the various qualifiers or were handpicked by the organizers. Some of these players were pro players from the Japanese scene that Western organizers were previously unable to reach. This tournament was said to have the best production and gameplay of any tournament of the time. This era of PPT was defined by the ambitious breaking of boundaries and the growth of the tournament scene. Suffice to say, this was the golden age of PPT. On December 8th, PPT2 launched as expected. What was not expected though was the game sucked. I'll elaborate upon this later. Remember the last chapter when I said all of the expectations for PPT2? None of these were fulfilled. In fact, PPT2 was worse than PPT1 in the Day 1 patch. Because of this, many players dropped out of Square 1 and the tournament was postponed indefinitely. The very next day on December 9th, the Tetris company sent a DMCA takedown to Tetra Online. The problem with this DMCA is that it was just the Tetris company throwing its weight around. The cited reason in the DMCA notice was that Tetra Online infringed on the visual expression of Tetris. Obviously, this is not protectable or a valid reason for a DMCA takedown, but the developers didn't have the money to fight this. Pretty much everyone in the community was outraged at this occurrence. To put this event into perspective, most Tetris players had spent the prior year dealing with impersonal, robotic, and corporatized living while in quarantine, with their only escape from this being Tetris and its community. Now that Tetra Online was taken down, it felt like the same corporate overlords had come to ruin yet another thing for us. Back to PPT2. Let's examine the reasons the game sucked and why people chose not to play it. The netcode. The netcode felt like it didn't change at all. In fact, it's highly likely that Sega used the exact same thing from the first game. The chain animations. For PPT2, Sega made the animations that would play when doing an attack extra fancy. While stylish, they would cause crippling lag, making the game unplayable on certain characters. The worst part is, you can't simply just turn off the animations to stop the lag, because if your opponent had animations on, your game would lag to prevent a desync, even though you had animations off. What this means is that both players need to have animations turned off to prevent lag, which can't be guaranteed when playing Puzzle League. This was made even worse by the fact that Puyo players would intentionally turn on animations when playing against a Tetris player to give themselves the advantage. Swap mode. With the new netcode, swap mode was not playable online without a very strong connection. The game was slower. The more you are forced to play slowly, the more efficient it becomes optimal to play. Center forward just so happens to be one of the most efficient ways to play, and as we know, people despise this setup. Many people took a top player being involved with Sega as confirmation that something would be done about forward. This obviously proved to be untrue, as the game indirectly buffed center forward. Hatred of the Tetris company. Because it was the Tetris company that sent the DMCA to Tetra Online, many people felt like it was no longer moral to support the Tetris company. In order to make an official Tetris game and avoid a lawsuit, you need to buy an expensive license from the Tetris company, which is what happened to make PPT2. Not wanting to give money that was part of the company that ruined Tetra Online, there was something of a boycott on PPT2. Alternative games. Even though the best PPT alternative was taken down, there was still the option to switch to Tetrio, which by this time had become the premier game of the community. Many PPT players jumped ship to Tetrio, similar to what happened after Tetrio's release. The price. PPT-1 costed $20, but for some reason Sega decided to mark up the price on the sequel to $40. What resulted from this was many people not being willing to pay such a high price for a barely working game. I still believe to this day PPT-2 would be a bigger game if it was at a more reasonable price. There were more issues, but these were the big ones. What occurred from this was the sort of state of limbo that the community was in. We had two options here. Our first was to accept the game as is and hope that it gets fixed in the future, or return to PPT-1 until the game gets fixed. If most of everyone in the community picked a single option here, it would have been fine, but this obviously didn't happen. Some players stuck to PPT-1, with some players moving on to the new game. What resulted was the already small player base being diluted between the two games. After the first 2 weeks of release, it was very hard to find matches in either game. What resulted was the second major exodus of PPT players for Tetrio. Oh, you thought that was it? Remember the PPT-2 PC release? Let's fast forward a bit. On January 27th, the Puyo official Twitter account announced the release date for PPT-2 PC. The day would be set to March 23rd, 2021. Fast forward again to the release date and a bunch of streamers have figured out that the Steam refund feature is quite lenient. To be exact, any game within 14 days of purchase and under 2 hours of playtime can be refunded. It also just so happens that the average Tetris stream is around 2 hours long. So what happened on launch day was, streamers bought the game with the preconceived notion that the game is bad, had a laugh about the game with their viewers, and then refunded the game at the end of the stream. Two notable streamers to do this were GarboCan and Blink. Blink was at least somewhat cordial when the behavior was called out on Twitter, but Garbo was largely unapologetic. You can form your own opinions on the ethics of doing this. To me though, I was not a fan of this. This era of PPT decimated the community and we're still recovering from it today. Once you hit rock bottom though, the only direction you can go is up. Even after PPT-2 decimated the community, some people still wanted to play the game and the devs were trying to fix the game. On February 4th, 2021, Sega released an update that sneakily fixed the lag caused by chain animations. Later that month, Puyo Tetris ran their first mock tournament. With spectator mode still not in the game, the stream was done by viewing replays on stream. While a more difficult format than simply spectating, it worked quite well and restored some faith in the game. Less than a week later, Sega updated PPT to add version 1.3.0, adding in spectator mode. This was a huge turning point for the game, and a mock tournament run by Puyo Tetris was held 3 days later. 1 month later, on April 4th, Puyo Tetris ran the first major tournament for PPT-2. Puzzle Cataclysm 3.0 plus 1.0. This was a very successful tournament with 55 players signing up. Later in the month, Puzzle Cataclysm Open Ultra was run, a Puyo-only tournament. This made some Puyo tournament organizers start running tournaments on PPT-2. Despite all of these developments, non-Puyo Tetris tournaments for the game were still quite inert. I imagine it was just the established community in the Puyo Tetris server that didn't want to leave but was happy to join tournaments in the server. For example, in the summer of 2021, I ran 6 weekly tournaments for my organization, Tag Cup. I found it very hard to get people to sign up, averaging around 15 signups for each tournament. During my brief break from running weeklies, Puyo Tetris ran the first major doubles tournament called PCO Alpha Omega on June 30th, 2021. On that same day, Sega released their final patch for PPT-2, which was the best one for the game yet. It sped up Tetris and slightly nerfed combos. While only a slight gesture, it gave players hope that more would be done to the game. Though, that was the last update at the time of making this video. This era of the game is best thought of as an extension of the Redemption arc. The difference now being that the quarantine restrictions are being loosened, allowing PPT to flourish in its best environment once again. On August 14th, Beast and Shin organized the first LAN tournament for Tetris since Xeno. Following the pattern of other LAN events, this tournament was well received. There was a slight outrage towards the grand finals when Wumbo beat Promo using center forward, but most people recognized the grand finals was still an amazing set. Not much would happen for the rest of the fall 2021, but December is when things started to pick up. On December 25th, Puyo Tetris ran their tournament Snow is Infinite. This tournament had a very good turnout on Twitch with an average viewership of just under 100. 5 days later, Kazu and Amamiya played an exhibition match in LAN format, part of a greater video game event. This event put so much hype in the game along with Snow is Infinite. The PPT Puyo scene wasn't being left out of the growth either. The bi-weekly tournaments called the Great Tuesday Rumble started on January 25th and still continued at the time of making this video. There was also the show event Rensa Rivals on March 5th, a 4-player bracket with stacked matches to keep the hype train going for Puyo. Back to Tetris. On January 8th, the Bankai Tetris League started. While not particularly exciting signups-wise, this league ended up backfiring a small amount, with players of the league such as Doremi and Kabuzled proclaiming their distaste for PPT after playing in the league. This wasn't particularly consequential in the grand scheme of things, but it did give a scare to the community, making them think the Dark Ages would repeat. Still chugging along though, Houston Shan announced his next LAN events, SoCal and Columbus. WPL SoCal was announced on March 22nd, 2022 and set to happen on June 4th. Shortly after, Puyo Tetworld announced their next increment in the PCO tournament series. The tournament had two brackets, the PPT2 Steam bracket on April 8th and the Switch bracket on April 9th. This tournament was special because it was trying out a brand new solution to the PPT matches being imbalanced, 32-second margin time. While currently the community is unsure if this is the solution to PPT, many people seem to like it and players are willing to join tournaments using the rule set. Another change in popular thought for PPT was the 4 red bans. On April 8th, I released a thread on Twitter discussing if 4 red bans are still necessary in today's metagame. I might adapt the thread into a video soon, but the link to the thread will be in the document in the description. All of these events culminated into two tournaments. WPL number 10 with the 32-second margin time, and Suki Open with no 4 red bans and a 32-second margin time. Similar to last year's Golden Age, barriers in the community are being broken and lots of tournaments are happening. Will the community fly too close to the sun again and be gravely disappointed, or will PPT make a comeback? As of today, it looks like our community has great times ahead of us, but we're still at large a niche game. And with all that in mind, you're up to date. Puyo Puyo Tetris is a very interesting story of a video game. It's a story of how developers can sabotage a game through neglect and complacency, but it's also a story of how people who genuinely love a game will continue to play it. If you're interested, I have in the description of this video a document with links to many of the events I mentioned in the video, and some other things I thought were interesting but not important enough to be included. Also, if you want to discuss the video with me, I recommend either joining my Discord server or leaving a YouTube comment. If I get enough questions, I'll make a follow-up to this video that is just a Q&A. This was my first video of this kind, and if you've made it this far, I sincerely thank you for watching.